Look at almost any photograph taken on a British street in the 1960s, and something immediately feels different. Ordinary people looked stylish. Not movie stars. Not wealthy socialites. Just everyday people. Teenagers standing outside record shops. Factory workers heading home. Young couples waiting at bus stops in the rain. Even in black and white photographs, Britain somehow looked more alive. And today, many people look back at those streets and ask the same question: what happened? How did ordinary British people once dress with so much pride, and why does modern Britain often feel so much more ordinary? To understand that, we need to go back to the Britain that existed before the colour, before the music, and before young people changed fashion forever. It's easy to imagine the 1960s as bright, exciting, and fashionable. But early post-war Britain looked very different. Much of the country was still recovering from the Second World War. Cities carried the scars of bombing. Food rationing had only recently ended. And for many families, life still revolved around practicality, routine, and modesty. People dressed carefully, but conservatively. Men often wore dark suits, polished shoes, and hats that made entire crowds look almost identical. Women were expected to look respectable rather than expressive. Fashion wasn't really about individuality yet. For older generations, clothing reflected discipline, class, and social order. You dressed properly because that's what respectable people did. But underneath that quiet, grey Britain, something new was beginning to grow. A younger generation was emerging. Teenagers with more freedom, more money, and less interest in becoming copies of their parents. And within just a few years, they would completely transform the way Britain looked. For perhaps the first time in British history, young people began influencing culture more than adults. Not politicians. Not royalty. Not the upper classes. Teenagers. Across Britain, a new youth culture exploded into life. In London, young mods rode Italian scooters through crowded streets wearing slim-cut suits, polished Chelsea boots, and sharp hairstyles inspired by European fashion. American rock and roll mixed with British music. Record shops became social spaces. Clothing became identity. For many young people, fashion was no longer about looking respectable. It was about looking modern. Suddenly, British streets filled with colour, confidence, and experimentation. Miniskirts shocked older generations. Boutiques appeared across places like Carnaby Street. And for the first time, ordinary working-class teenagers could help shape national style. Britain was no longer dressing for tradition. It was dressing for excitement. And that change didn't just transform fashion. It transformed the atmosphere of everyday life itself. Part of the reason people looked more stylish in the 1960s was surprisingly simple. Getting dressed actually meant something. Leaving the house was still treated as an occasion. Going into town on a Saturday felt important. Even small routines carried a sense of pride. People owned fewer clothes than they do today, but they often cared for them far more. Shoes were polished. Coats were repaired instead of replaced. Many young men saved money for a single well-cut jacket. Women carefully chose outfits for shopping trips, dances, cinemas, or evenings out. And because photographs were rarer, people often made more effort when they knew they might be seen. There was also less separation between formal and casual life. Today, tracksuits, hoodies, and trainers are common almost everywhere. But in the 1960s, many people still believed appearance reflected character. Looking smart suggested self-respect. It showed discipline, pride, sometimes even ambition. And perhaps most importantly, British streets were still deeply social places. High streets were crowded with independent shops, cafes, cinemas, pubs, market stalls, and record stores. Teenagers gathered outside boutiques. Friends bumped into each other unexpectedly. People noticed one another. Clothing became part of that social atmosphere. Fashion wasn't only about trends. It was part of everyday public life. And that gave ordinary streets a kind of energy that many people feel has slowly disappeared. Of course, every generation romanticizes the past a little. The 1960s had problems too. Britain was still unequal. Opportunities were limited for many people. And not everyone could afford fashionable clothing. But when people compare old photographs to modern Britain, they often notice the same thing. The streets no longer feel quite as alive. Part of that change came from fast fashion. Clothing became cheaper, quicker, and more disposable. Styles moved faster. Quality declined. And many town centers slowly filled with the same chain stores repeated across the country. But something else changed too. Modern life became more private. People spend less time socializing in public spaces. Many high streets lost cinemas, dance halls, music shops, and local cafes that once brought communities together. Online shopping replaced afternoons spent wandering through town centers. Even nightlife began disappearing from many British towns. And as everyday public life faded, so did some of the effort people once put into being seen. Because fashion had never only been about clothes. It had been connected to atmosphere, community, excitement, a feeling that going out into the world mattered. That's why old photographs can feel strangely emotional today. People aren't just mourning old fashion. They're mourning the world that surrounded it. Maybe the reason people looked so stylish in 1960s Britain wasn't simply because trends were better. Maybe it was because everyday life itself felt more meaningful. Going into town meant something. Meeting friends meant something. Saturday nights meant something. Not just the coats, or the hairstyles, or the polished shoes, but the feeling that Britain once had more color, more identity, and somehow more life. Because when you look closely at those crowded streets of the 1960s, you're not only seeing fashion. You're seeing a country that still believed ordinary life could feel special.